For a while now, there have been cases in PvP where one player can attack the other, but the opponent can't attack back. How can that be possible? To find out, we need to take a look at how Jagex has defined line of sight. The algorithm is actually pretty simple to understand. A line is drawn between the attacker and the opponent, starting on the edge closest to the opponent and ending on the same side of the opponent. The game then looks at all the edges of the tiles the line passes through, and line of sight is then granted only if there are no walls or objects blocking any of the edges. Okay, great, but how does this actually create safe spots? Well, the problem is that when the same algorithm is used for the opponent, the line starts on the opposite side of the tile, and thus we have a different line which goes through different edges of different tiles. This is why one player can see the other, but the other can't see back. So, how do we fix this? There are a few different solutions, some which I will call a quick hack and others which I will call a proper solution. The first one takes inspiration from PVM. In PVM, these safe spots don't exist, so we could just copy that. In PVM, line of sight is always calculated from the player to the monster. This way, if one has line of sight to the other has always line of sight back. The equivalent solution for PvP would be to check line of sight from the player with lower PID to the player with higher PID. Although, since PID changes regularly nowadays, this might not be the best solution. The second solution takes inspiration from the first solution. We could just determine a way to always check line of sight from one tile to the other. One way to do this is to always check line of sight from the western tile to the eastern tile. That would also fix the problem. Another solution is to check line of sight both ways and only grant it if it succeeds both times. And finally, the last hacky solution is to check line of sight both ways again, but instead only grant it if one of them succeeds. So, now that we have a few hacky solutions, let's see what the proper solution would be. For a proper solution, we would make the line of sight algorithm actually symmetrical. Instead of having two different lines, we could move them so they merge together. This can be done in a few different ways. For example, the line could start in the middle of the tile, or it could start from the closest corner or from the closest edge. However, there is one more problem with this. The line could go through a corner instead of an edge, and Jagex's current algorithm doesn't handle corners symmetrically. There are two paths to take here. Either check the tile to the left and then to the south, or check the south first and then the left one. But first, let's see how Jagex handles corners. It's very simple actually. If the denominator of the reduced fraction created by the distances of the axes in the two-dimensional coordinate system have at least two distinct prime factors, take the path in the direction of the longest axis first, otherwise the other one. So to fix that, we can apply one of our hacks explained earlier to ensure that the path taken is the same regardless of if you start it from the beginning or the end. And that's everything we need. Perfect! A symmetrical line wouldn't just fix PvP safe spots, but it would also fix one of the inconsistencies the current algorithm has. One of these players is able to telegrab the shark without moving, but not the other one. Can you guess which one? The problem here is that the lines start at different edges of the tiles. Looking at the lines, we can see why this inconsistency is happening. In fact, there are a lot of tiles where this works differently than you would think. Another example of this inconsistency is in the Inferno. There are a few tiles where you can't see Zack, but if you move further away you can see him. This is because there's a wall right next to him. For monsters bigger than 1 by 1, line of sight is based on the closest tile to the player, which is the corner of Zack in this case. So if we draw these lines again, we can see why line of sight is failing. Jagex have recently decided to tackle this PvP safe spots problem and have released beta worlds for us to test their solution on. Now that we have a good understanding of how to solve the problem, can you guess which solution they decided to go with? Put your guess in the comments, A for a quick hacky solution or B for a proper solution. I will give you a few seconds to pause the video and make your guess. And the answer is... Option C. So what is option C? Just copy RuneScape 3. Since RuneScape 3 already solved our problem, it makes sense to recycle code that has already been well tested during the last 10 years. So, how is line of sight defined in RuneScape 3? Well, it's not as great as one would think. It's a bit of a mixture of a quick hack, a symmetrical algorithm, and the original unsymmetrical algorithm. Basically, there are two differences from the original algorithm. Firstly, line of sight is always calculated from west to east, just like one of the solutions we looked at earlier. Secondly, if it's a straight diagonal line, they use a different algorithm, which is essentially the symmetrical one explained earlier. The line will only go through corners, and for those, they grant line of sight if either path works. Okay, great, but why is this second part needed to fix PvP safe spots? Well, it isn't. I don't actually know why this change was made, and the developers probably don't know either, since the decision was made 10 years ago. So, how will this change affect the rest of the game? The primary difference is that diagonally trapping range and magic monsters will no longer work. However, Jagex aren't changing NPC movement pathing, or well, at least not until they watched this video. Which means that you can now corner trap and safe spot one by one melee monsters without having to flinch them. This means that you can now more easily safe spot all the melee Barrows brothers, including in the tunnels. This also has an impact on various quest bosses like Kruck in Monkey Madness 2 and your favorite level 2 Rabbit. Ha! Your time is over, Rabbit. Everything else basically has to be looked at a case by case. One case is the doors to Dagnaught Kings. It turns out that you no longer have line of sight to the other door. Okay, that shouldn't be hard to fix, just copy whatever they did in RuneScape 3, right? Actually, it still works from the west side, so I can just pretend like we were always supposed to enter from the west side. Another case is the line of sight problem we looked at earlier at Suck and Inferno. But now you no longer have line of sight from the entire east side of the room. How should we fix this? The easy solution is to just remove the blocking walls next to Suck. Although this would mean that the original spots that were blocking line of sight will disappear, which makes the boss easier. But maybe that's acceptable. There's a lot of other small changes that you might notice, but I mentioned the ones I've found so far, which I think will be the most impactful. People who play at a not so high skill level will probably not notice much of a difference though. So that just about explains everything. Any questions?
Yeah, works. Why not just make this change for PvP only?
Maybe they wanted to make the game mechanics more consistent by not separating line of sight mechanics in PvM and PvP. Although not every inconsistency is being fixed. Keep in mind, however, that these changes are not set in stone yet, which is why Jagex are currently running a few beta worlds. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching and have a good day.